Warren Lysaght is a man that decided to be a part of the solution for the war on drugs. As a police officer, he has been part of a force that has visited clandestine drug labs, who has arrested multiple people being involved in a war that we feel like we just cannot win. But Warren didn't just decide to stop there. Instead, receiving the prestigious Churchill Fellowship Award, he travelled internationally, understanding not just what's going on in his own country of Australia, but what's happening globally. To see how drugs are impacting other areas, to understand what solutions are working, and also to bring that knowledge back here. Detective Inspector Warren Lysaght is a man that has a commitment, a conviction to seeing things through. And as a result of that, he's talking today to me on Think Uncommon. This is a highly sensitive episode. You will hear stories of drug overdose. You will hear about what he experienced on the streets and what he has written about in his Churchill report. I encourage you to watch this episode cautiously because there are some highly sensitive topics which you may find affect you. However, don't let that stop you watching it. This is an important conversation, one that needs to be had, and one that we need to understand that even if you're not on the front line like Warren is, it doesn't mean you can't do anything. In fact, if you watch the whole episode, you will understand how just a little bit of contribution from every single one of us can make a huge difference to a war that we feel like we will never win. Let me introduce to you Detective Inspector Warren Lysaght. Welcome to the Think Uncommon podcast. I'm Jo Jackson, your host for today. Most people think they understand drugs until they come face to face with the reality of them. And today's guest lives every day in that reality. He's a detective inspector of the New South Wales Police, leading investigations into clandestine drug labs, organised crime, and drug networks across the state. But what makes this conversation with Warren Lysaght different is that he's gone beyond Australia. Through his Churchill Fellowship, sitting face to face with families, victims, and systems already dealing with what's coming, he's seen it all. This isn't a conversation about drugs. It's a conversation about truth, responsibility, and what happens when we get it wrong. Warren, welcome to Think Uncommon.
Thanks for having me today.
Lovely. Now, throughout the course of this episode today, I am going to refer you to the friendly term of was, if that's okay.
It's fine.
Was, aka Warren. Now, you and I are friends, and we have had many a conversation about some of the similarities that we share in relation to the topic that we're going to talk about today. I wanted to bring you on to talk specifically about your experience in relation to drugs nationally, globally, and what you have seen with all of your experience. So thank you so much for spending the time to come and talk to me today.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Joe.
We're not going to waste any time though. We're going to get straight into it. And my first question that I have for you is, you've spent your career in organised crime, drug networks, and clandestine labs. Anyone looking at your LinkedIn profile or having read the report that we're going to refer to today will know all about some of what you have seen and experienced. Tell me about the reality of the world that most people never see.
Yeah, so I suppose to give a little bit of background about me is I've been with the New South Wales Police Force now for 31 years. A majority of that time has been in criminal investigation within State Crime Command in a number of different areas. In that time, I suppose I've seen a lot in respect to drugs. Most of my criminal investigation career has been chasing drug dealers and drug manufacturer offences. But in that time, you just see things, I suppose it's with age too, you see things a little bit differently. I've been involved in what is called the war on drugs in all that time. And here we are still fighting the same war all these years on. And if we keep up the same pace, and it's my personal opinion, the war was just going to be a never-ending war. I had an opportunity to do something different, and that was by looking at the Winston Churchill Trust fellowships. They're offered once a year to all Australia, and the Winston Churchill Trust is designed for people with a passion. It doesn't matter what your passion is, it's someone with a passion who wants to go out, see the world, and take things from the world and bring it back to make Australia a better place. And as I said, it doesn't matter what your passion is. I wanted things to be a little bit different. I wanted to look towards what can we do for different in that war of drugs. There's some pretty scary drugs out there, which we'll talk about soon, but I wanted to come back with something a little bit different to, I suppose, be innovative and be contemporary in how we do things. The question that you had is how we see things differently. What is differently is from the drug perspective, there's multiple sides. Like we see from us, we see a lot, and I speak about this when I do some training presentations, is we always see a side where it's either glorified through television and media. We see a side where it's all the cool things that happen, like when you take these drugs. But what we see, and especially from that policing side in my experience, is the trauma that actually is attached to all sorts of drug use. It doesn't matter what the drug use is, there's some form of trauma, whether that's been mental trauma, physical trauma through obviously the violence of organized crimes or the violence within the home. It's everything just surrounds it as trauma. They say that drugs is a victimless crime and drug use is a victimless crime. I disagree with that so much. There's people who are being harmed, and it's not just the person who's using the drug, but it's the family around them. That be the parents, the siblings, the wife, the husband, the children, the grandchildren. There's always someone who's really hurting, and then that obviously then extends to where does that trauma take those people in the future. And I wanted to do my 2 cents worth to see if I can sort of not change that. I don't feel that I could change it, but adjust things and help and assist in, I suppose, influencing a change.
The best reason for it, right? Go out
Yeah.
and do something different to make a positive impact on the future. I
Yes.
like that you referred to drugs are a victimless crime. I do remember the first time I heard that term, and I'm pretty sure I've never been as angry as I was that day. Anyone who suggests that drugs are a victimless crime has obviously never been on the front line or been affected by someone who has either been an addict or has been directly affected by a one-time event with drugs. And I'm complete in agreement that drugs are definitely not and cannot ever be a victimless crime. So I've noticed on your LinkedIn profile that you've got some examples of some of my dad used to refer to them as drug busts. I don't know if that's the term that we still use these days, but you put images up of some of the clandestine labs that we see in Sydney here, labs that could be literally just down the street from where we live. Once upon a time, you would see these types of places in certain suburbs, in certain areas of certain states, and now it can literally be down the road. What are some of the shocks that people see these days that they never thought they'd experience?
Yeah, look, clan labs or clandestine drug laboratories, they've been around for quite some time, but you're right, there used to be to certain areas and the like. Nowadays, like the way that we're a very connected community, we move around, we shift around, we've got, internet, and just the fact that, the World Wide Web and the way we work that now, it means that everything is so much closer and people can move around so much quicker. It's sometimes quicker than what we can catch them, keep up with. And what we do see is that places that temporary residences like rentals, like Airbnbs, we see them commonly getting used now. And it can be in a place that's a dim lit, seedy street, but it can also be in a very affluent area of Sydney. It can be in a new residence, a brand new residence that's still in a houses that are still getting built up in the area. There's no bias on where it can be done. The whole idea is that this needs to be secretive. It's always a short, temporary stay there, and they move on. We do see the clan labs, we do see that even they shift the methods they use. They're always adjusting with what's happening around the world and what us as law enforcement are able to intervene and capture. They're always moving ahead of that. It's a real cat and mouse game that just keeps us moving.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's different now. Crime is mobile. And once upon a time, you would have seen something with this significant complication of setup had to be static. It couldn't be mobile. You couldn't be lifting it up in a truck or whatnot. But these days, this sort of thing is literally something you can pack up in less than a day.
Yeah, definitely. It can go in and then to move around. It can be packed away even under a bed if need be until it's required to be used. And then, the next time it's used, they just set it back up again. The chemistry background with these people, they're not chemists, they're backyard chemists. They've usually learnt the trade craft from people before them, and they've gone on from an apprenticeship to doing it themselves. But it can essentially, and the fact that it is a clandestine laboratory, you don't need scientifically great equipment to be able to do things. Yes, we do see it, and yes, it certainly would be an advantage to how much you're, I suppose, producing. But you don't need all that equipment. You can use very rudimentary equipment. But the problem with that is it comes with a lot more hazards and a lot more risks. And we do see that, and sometimes in that the risks that they take can lead to very detrimental effects to them. And we've had a number of lab explosions before that.
Yes, there was one not too far from where I live at the moment, I think about 12 months ago. And I do remember actually hearing it, and I've just gone, wow, that was loud. I wonder what that was. Next thing you know, there's fire trucks racing to the scene, and then next day you see it on the news. It's, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That type of explosion, that makes sense. And as I
Yes.
said, I'm in an affluent area. You just can't tell where they are these days. It's no longer socialized into a particular area of a city geographically. So for those people who are really not advised on what drugs are and what drug categories are out there. It's really easy to watch the NCISs and the Lord knows what on TV and go, yes, I'm a drug expert. I know everything I need to know. But one of the first things that I recognized when I started trying to understand addiction as a whole and by proxy, by standard of that, understanding drugs, was I didn't actually know as much as I thought I did. So I think it's fair for us to start with educating people who are watching this podcast or listening to the main categories of drugs that are out there that the police force or otherwise are dealing with.
Yeah, look, and we deal with two in particular that I'll talk about is our depressants and our stimulants. And our depressant state is, I'll talk about in a second, but the stimulants are probably the biggest thing for Australia. And it's not really a boasting fact, but we actually have a high record. And I think the UNODC market as Australia has the highest per capita use of stimulants, being cocaine and methamphetamine. It's not something that we should really boast about, but it's unfortunately the case, and it's not the case for 1 year. It's been a couple of years running now, and with unfortunately, when you see the wastewater samples that the ACIC produce in their articles and documents, it shows the telltale signs that is certainly the case. What is a stimulant? Well, it's cocaine, methamphetamine. It's something that really picks you up for pretty much a short space of time, but then you crash out pretty bad. The other form that we have is the depressants. We have things like THC, or what we know is obviously marijuana or cannabis is a form, but there's a more dangerous form, and that's an opioids. And the biggest one for that is heroin. With obviously it comes from that same family as morphine, but heroin is obviously much stronger. And then what we're starting to see now and experience across the globally in particular is synthetic opioids, which are far stronger than even heroin. It's heroin, fentanyl is one of those, and it's 50 times stronger than heroin. A lethal dose is zero point 0.2 or 0.02 milligrams. It's very lethal. And then what we're also seeing is nitazenes. Now, fentanyl actually has a medicinal purpose. There, fentanyl patches, fentanyl lollipops are given to people with chronic pain, in particular cancer patients, elderly patients, but they're in very small doses. What we see in particular in the United States is we're starting to see, or we're not starting to see, it's been there quite some time now, is fentanyl has been distributed originally as an adulterant to heroin, as a replace substitute for heroin, but now fentanyl is what people are seeking. The addiction's that high. In other parts of the world that can't get fentanyl, we're starting to see nitazines. And nitazines is a group of drugs that, unlike fentanyl, had no medicinal purpose. It was produced around the same time. It's not brand new. It's something that was produced back in the 50s, as a matter of fact. And it was dormant until someone looked at obviously alternates, synthetic alternates. They found fentanyl and they also found nitazines. And nitazines has the same potency as fentanyl. It uses a number of different ingredients, but in the end, it's a synthetic opioid that still has this as devastating effects as fentanyl.
Kind of makes you wonder why drugs exist in the first place.
Scary stuff.
Very scary stuff. And I'm hearing a lot of terms in there, opioids, terms that people might be familiar with, but the extension of that when we start talking about more extensive synthetics. And what people may not realize and may have just picked up on is a lot of the drugs that we're actually having addictive problems with started off as some kind of pain reliever.
Yeah, well, it certainly was that the case with opioids and the
Yeah.
synthetic opioids. That was something, and it's played out on a few TV series and that you can see on your streaming channels. But yeah, it started pretty much as pain relief. Here I thought was it was just a significant addiction problem to heroin and just in a certain part or a certain demographic when I was first looking into this and first started researching my travels. But then it was soon I realized that that's not the case at all. It was for pain relief. And then it was then realized that it was so highly potent that some of the pain relief that they had, and in particular OxyContin, they turned off the tap. And people were looking for an alternative because there was no way out of it. And then they started moving towards heroin and synthetic opioids. And that was a terrible thing to see. And to hear some of the stories when I was overseas about that and how they come to be and what happened to those families and how they got ripped apart as a result of that was, yeah, it was tough stuff to listen to.
Now, I'm looking forward to hearing a replay of some of those stories that you refer to in your Churchill report. There are some tragic circumstances where some unexplained outcomes just come from nowhere, where you look at a scenario and think everything's perfect, and then suddenly one day it's not.
Yeah.
And I think the takeaway from that is that it's very easy for us to assume that a drug addict, as we have deemed the term, is someone that has just decided to start using recreational drugs and abuse them purely because they can't control it. But it would be remiss of us not to refer to the fact that people who become dependent on drugs can actually start off being in a situation where they're being used as pain relief.
Yeah, everyone's got a story. And I think that was the big thing that I really took away from it. And jumping ahead a little bit, and I suppose learning when I was on my travels and just hearing these stories. And even before I started traveling, to speak with some people and hear their stories and of, loved ones that they've lost. Everyone has a story, and it was quite heartbreaking to see. You know, some of the stories just so full of trauma. Others are a case of just misadventure. But the problem with the synthetic opioids that they take, and in particular, a lot of my focus around synthetic opioids was when I was in the US. It was the fact that like it's not bias and it's ruthless. It's so ruthless. Like it doesn't give you a second chance. It was put to me by one person in particular who put it a very good way. And once upon a time, we used to, with the way that drugs were, and back in the olden days, as it was, you used to be able to. Most people, it was a crossroad you would reach. You would have a bad trip or something, but you would still have that opportunity to go, that was bad. I'm not doing that again. Like I've got to pull myself out of this. Synthetic opioids, you don't get the option.
Right.
Like it was a case, and it's a slogan, and it's a big campaign in the United States with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, that one pill can kill. And there's videos, Snapchat videos of kids taking pills, and 10 minutes later they're dead.
Dead.
It's a scary concept out there. And then but this is the world we live in now, not to scare the people about that, but it's something that we're just got to accept, and we're just got to make sure that we can adapt and evolve our way of thinking to the new forms of drugs that we have out there.
Yeah, I completely understand that perspective too. I remember a friend of mine had an experience when he was, I think he was about 20 years old. A couple of his mates decided to drop a trip together. His friends had done it before. He'd never touched anything stronger than alcohol, and his mind couldn't handle it. What the outcome of that was, he was terrorizing people in the street. He took a baseball bat to the house that he lived in, almost took a baseball bat to his mates. It took four people to subdue him, and eventually he pushed them all off him. He was that strong, and all they could do was try and contain him and keep an eye on him while he went and did what he did until he literally just passed out
Wow.
and started to weaken off. And I've heard multiple stories of that experience that he had, and to this day, he has not forgotten it. And to see him after the fact, he spent days in hospital, and psychologically, it took him months to recover back to something that resembled normal. He went back to his day-to-day life, but he just wasn't the same. You could see it in him. It had left some kind of tarnish, a trauma on him that it took him months and months to be able to process, let alone absolutely delete from his system. And to this day, he still recalls it. And you can see I don't want to talk about this because it just brings up bad memories. And the things that psychologically came to the surface, which was what was especially interesting, his traumas and his experiences of the past that maybe weren't dealt with came to the surface, rushing to the surface all at once. And he's got this huge surge of emotions that he didn't know what to do with, and it just transpired into rage.
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? Like those things will last with you forever. Like what you did on that day, especially if it's someone who is, you could be the kindest of heart, but it just transforms a person into that. And then what happens to the body after that? Like, is there an urge? The body wants an urge because there was some feeling that it had at the time, unaware of what they were actually doing in reality, that the body goes, that was pretty good. Let's go there again.
Do it again.
That then, and that's obviously the addiction component. There's also the trust component. Like people around you, you say and do things that then forevermore they're going to be on their guard with you. They're going to put a bit of a wall up because they're concerned about what you will do. It's the lighter end of trauma, but it's trauma nonetheless. And this is what it creates.
It's a very interesting conversation considering that on one hand we have herbal plant medicine that's being advocated as the way to psychedelic freedom, where people are taking ayahuasca and multiple other options, psilocybin, etc., to find themselves and free their souls. And not all experiences are great. And even with some people that are having what they would define as a good experience, are still coming out of it saying, I wish I hadn't have done it.
Yeah, like they say, it's drugs are bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to take this opportunity, which if anyone hasn't already did work that out, I'm very anti-drug personally. I'm not going to stand here and say that I'm a saint by any means, but what I am going to say is I've been able to have experiences throughout my life, both firsthand and as an observer, of exactly what drugs do to people, and have spent many times at Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings for me to be in a position where I don't just understand why people do drugs, but also try and understand the addiction itself, because I don't believe this is going away. I think that what we need to do is to understand how to manage it and best case scenario, prevent it. But if we're of an opinion that this is just going to be eradicated, I think we're a little naive.
That's most definitely the case. It's something that I think is always going to be, it's always been in society. History and a long ancient history has shown that it's always been in society.
Yeah.
Moving forward, there's no doubt it will always remain in society, but it's how we manage it. And it's obviously There's some bad stuff out there, and it's, I suppose, working together in some form of collaboration to make sure that doesn't have that stranglehold that is now being experienced in other parts of the world.
Absolutely, completely agree. And it's definitely something that's on all of us to be involved with. I don't think any of us can afford the luxury of turning a blind eye and assuming it won't happen to us.
No, that's definitely correct.
So, on your Churchill experience, you were given the opportunity in 2025, I believe. You did your travels. You went through multiple countries with a view of just seeing what was going on. And one of the things I did notice about when you put your application through is you chose specifically to focus on one particular drug.
Yeah, I did. So the Winston Churchill Trust, as I said, it's for anyone who's got a knowledge and a passion to want to go out and bring something back to change the community, change society for the better in Australia. And it's, for me, it was something that I had been considering for a while. I had previously done a scholarship internally with the New South Wales Police Force, but it was a what's called the Michael O'Brien Memorial Scholarship. And I did that back in 2015, and it was tough work. That one, I was away for 6 weeks, and I traveled to Canada, United States, and then a quick visit past Hong Kong on the way back home. And when I was in the United States, my extension of that was Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, up to Ottawa, over to Vancouver, down to LA, and then over to Hong Kong. And that was a little bit different. That was in a former life. I was investigating money laundering investigations at the time. But when I was there, I saw some things in respect to obviously the connections with the drug world that was sort of remained with me. And it was a little bit of a thought that at some stage I'd like to go and explore that. 10 years later, I built up the courage, or 9 years later, I built up the courage to do it again. And I submitted my application in 2024 and got through quite a rigorous interview process to be given the Churchill Fellowship. And the Churchill Fellowship I got was the Donald Mackay Memorial Fellowship. And Donald Mackay, for those who don't know, was a bit of a trailblazer in standing up against the drugs out in Griffith back in the day, back in the 70s, when they were having some massive issues with cannabis plantations and the Italian organised crime. He was very outspoken there, politically motivated, but looking after his community, and he had enough. Unfortunately for Donald, one day Donald went missing, or one night Donald went missing, and has never been seen again. And it's been highly linked to Italian organised crime, but no one has ever been charged for his murder.
I'm just going to take a pause there, Warren, if you don't mind, because this is one of the reasons why people choose not to talk about a topic like this, is because the risk is quite significant. If you choose to be a person that advocates against something that makes a lot of money, that's criminalized, there is a huge risk in standing up, in being heard, and you can easily find yourself in a position where, just like Donald McKay was, you can be targeted for trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, look, it's a scary thing, and like we were saying before we come on the air, like the notion of, can you imagine what the community was like around that time? Here they would have been standing, the community would have been standing behind what Mr. McKay had to say, and then all of a sudden he's missing, and you knew, like you had that deep down thought that this is as a result that there was what he was standing up for. And you can only imagine the community all just would have went into a sort of into their shell, and it would have been quite scary. Look, and I suppose with what it is today, if people observe things, there's ways and means for that to be, there's still ways to be able to call that out without having to stand out completely. That we've got things like Crime Stoppers. You can just contact your local police. You can contact your local member. You don't need to necessarily stand up, but we can't stop standing up, if that makes sense. Like we can't lie down and accept allowing this into our communities. And there's people, I suppose, in my profession that have gone that one step further. That we want to put ourselves there to be that front line and protect our community. And that's ultimately way back in the days when that was when, I suppose, when they say why you wanted to join the police, it was that protecting the community. It was that sense of duty that I wanted to have, and I still have to this very day, is to protect the community.
Absolutely. And frankly, as a member of society, and I know you're a humble guy and you probably won't like to hear this too much, but thank God for men like you who decide to
Absolutely not.
go out
I'm
and,
not one.
do the thing.
Yeah, no, I'm not one to take kudos. I'm just doing my job. So I always take my hat off to many other professions in front of mine. So
Yeah,
I always learn to say thank you. But it's, yeah, it's for me, it's the natural thing. And I think for many in my profession, it's just the natural thing. This is what we want to do. This is what we chose to do. And this is what we love to do. Everyone has their hard days, but so does every other job. So it's one of those things. But thank you.
absolutely. Now, I noticed that you decided to take on the fellowship discussing fentanyl, which currently is not a big issue in Australia, thankfully. However, we do have a little bit of a problem in Australia with the utilisation of drugs. It's not as big as people might think. 14% of the national crime carries impact with drug-related offences. So it's not huge. And I'm happy to say that it does look like, according to the latest statistics, that it is on the decline, which is good to know. But it is important for us to understand the impact of drugs on not just our community, but also the future with our children.
Yeah, and I suppose I'll take a step back from that, and which leads into what you've just said, is when I chose my Churchill Fellowship, it was all about finding how we as a community can work together to ultimately protect ourselves from the new novel substances, which is fentanyl in particular. Fentanyl hasn't got its foothold in Australia, and that is a fantastic thing. There's probably a few different reasons why that hasn't occurred, which I won't really go into, but it's all about sort of preventing it from happening here. The places I wanted to go and the places I chose to go were places that I felt I could immerse myself. I didn't want it just to be around boardroom tables, just going from boardroom tables from place to place. I wanted to be out there. I wanted to experience it. I wanted to feel it as best as I possibly can. So all the places I went were somewhere where that was heavily impacted by either fentanyl itself, in particular for Canada and the United States, or other hard drugs when I moved over to Europe. So my travels took me to Vancouver. I went back to Vancouver, and in particular, my focus there was East Hastings Street, which is globally renowned for its population, the community of the East Hastings Street being heavily addicted to what was used to be heroin, but now it's fully fentanyl. I moved through Washington, D.C., New York, and before that, I missed one, Portland over in Oregon. All of those places have got a long-standing history with fentanyl use, or New York, and is the biggest city in the world. And it's, the use of fentanyl in particular communities there. Portland was well renowned for some new programs that they brought in and the decriminalization that they conducted there, which didn't go so well. So it was good to hear from the lessons learnt there. Washington DC is Washington DC. Everything it's all policy and it's all comes from and stems from the US is Washington DC. So moving from there and listening to some of the law enforcement there, I then went over to see what it was like over in Europe because Europe has a different way of moving, especially here in Australia. We are influenced by not only the United States, but we've got some European influences. So it was important to get that side of perspective. So I went to Portugal, which has got a heavy history of heroin use, but there was a lot of good things happening there in respect to some alternatives to their charging. And one particular place that I spent a lot of time with is an organization called Crochet and what they were doing in allowing recovery to happen and embracing that. And then I went to where did I go next? I went to Dublin, so Ireland. There was some fantastic collaboration that was going there. It wasn't on my original list of places to go, but after having a few pre-meetings before I went overseas, which was one of the best things I did, is having a lot of pre-meetings. I learnt of some great collaboration that was being done by the guards with their health system over there. So I wanted to hear from that. There was a public holiday there, so I had done a quick sneak up to Belfast to meet with someone up there and hear from their side in Northern Ireland. And then I finished up in London where I met with the Met Police. All those places had a very good story to tell to get that holistic approach. It then sort of, I suppose, from there, it become hearing about their stories from all those places. And you talked about sort of, the 14% of the drug use, but just hearing the stories about how people got there, whether that was talking to some of the people that were heavily addicted on East Hastings or speaking to people in Portland who are at a clinic trying to look at alternates. Well, I would say it was alternate medicine, but looking at ways out, but hearing their stories of trauma, there's some heavily traumatic stories about what they've gone through to be where they are. And hearing the stories of recovery with, from there was a particular person in Virginia that I met with, and she lost her daughter, and her daughter's addiction come as a result of her own addiction, and how she is now a campaigner for all good things and recovery. There was so many stories out there, and then hearing the stories as well from particular community groups and organizations that are doing their best, and like I said before, the lessons learnt from what they've done. Not everything that we do succeeds, but they've given it a shot and they've learnt from their mistakes and took the best things out of that. And they're still, it's not like they then pack up shop and go away. They just go, okay, that didn't work, but these are good things. And then they start evolving that. And that was one of the best things I saw in Portland. There was some significant mistakes that they'd done and they recognized, and they knew they were rushing things in. So they took a bit more of a backward step, learned to
Oh, that's good
collaborate a
to
lot
see.
better, and brought in a different approach with the same mission, and things were progressing very well.
Yeah. I think that's definitely important, right? When we're trying to implement something. I mean, I'm very well versed in the change process, and one of the worst things that we can do is think we have this light bulb idea and like this is the solution, this is going to work, let's just rush it through. And then the people that are impacted, they don't buy into the solution. There's suspicious of it, there's trust issues, there's cost issues. There are all of these barriers to them deciding to engage in the outcome and be part of the solution that you're providing them, that no matter how much of a good idea it is and how much it looks like it's going to work on paper, if we don't engage the community, if we don't ask perspectives, if we don't get involved with people outside of ourselves to help them understand, they're not going to adopt it no matter how good a solution it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I did learn is you certainly can't rush. You can't rush anything in, and anything that was rushed in was never really succeeded in the long term. It may have some good short term goals. It may achieve those, but long term, it just things fall back down again. It just becomes, just it just becomes another flavor in the candy shop. Really, no one's really interested in it. So, what I did see was places where they took a slow, methodic steps in phases. There was a greater engagement, and you're right about that. You're so right about that. Like it shouldn't be up to one part of the community. We need to collaborate, and that was one of the biggest parts of me going overseas is the collaborative piece. The police can do a certain things, it can't do other things. Health can do certain things and other can't do other things. But it's not
Mhm.
just those two organizations which seem to be taking the forefront. Like it's the involvement of all the social services. It's the involvement of community groups. Depending on where you are, you may want to engage with particular community groups, especially when you're starting to talk about our outlying areas, our regional areas, which are sort of got a, I suppose, become a higher risk. And so when I was overseas, I went into an Indigenous community just outside of Vancouver, Alice Nation, to hear from them how they engage with law enforcement, how they engage with health services, how they've got their own services to be able to, I suppose, influence and reach their community better so they actually have an investment in it. because you got to get them invested. If they're not going to be invested, then what's the point?
What's the
Put
point?
you can put
Exactly.
all the posters out there in the world and put out all the cool campaigns, but if you're
Yeah.
not going to give them something to invest in, then it becomes pointless. So to have that reach and understand, to have someone to be able to make that connection to, it may not exactly come from the main places that we think. So, we've got to be open to that. And then we should be all allowing those people a seat at the table in the end.
We also need to remember as well, which your Churchill report beautifully outlines, it takes a village. It really does. It's not just about, I don't have children, therefore I'm not impacted, or you know what, I'm a grandparent now, I've got nothing to offer, or I'm a young person, not really something I need to worry about right now. This is something that's either going to affect us in our current period, in our future, or has already in our past. For us to consider the fact that at some stage in our lives drugs will not affect us probably is a statement we want to reconsider because the likelihood is it will.
Yeah, look, and 100%, like everyone in the community, it is the community, and that is everyone in the community has a part to play. Obviously, I'm talking about those organizations that have a seat at the table, but the voices behind those are just the individuals within the community. And we are all affected. Like we can't say that we're not affected because like we only have to turn on the news and there's always just something that's happening within our community. Like there's the trauma piece. And like the best way to put it is they say in 2023, 73,000 people died of fentanyl overdose in the United States.
Yeah.
Like that fills one of our pretty much most of our stadiums. It's a scary notion, but the fact is that's the people who died. How about the people they left behind?
Yeah.
Like the grandparents, the parents, the children. Like it just leaves so many people. And then obviously you times that, even if you times that by what a standard family is, which is mum and dad and two and a half kids, like that's a lot of people. There's a lot of people that are affected. So to walk around and say, "Oh no, that's not my problem," I think is a very naive approach. It is something that does affect us. It's a case in the United States. There's nearly everyone in the United States, if not everyone in the United States, at least knows someone who has died of an overdose. We don't want that here. We don't want that in Australia. Like, but to do that, it takes the work of all of us. And it doesn't matter who you are. You are still someone's child. You're still someone's uncle, auntie. You're still someone's friend, like who has children. Like there is something that we can all do to have our little part to defend, in a sense, defend Australia in the future from
Yeah.
novel substances and these very harmful substances that are out there.
That's perfectly said too, was there is something that we can all do. It doesn't matter how small it is. There's absolutely something that we can all do. When you were overseas doing the Churchill Fellowship, I noticed that you met quite a few families as well as organizations who were trying to eradicate the problem or work with the problem. And one of the things that really struck me about your report was the fact that some of these kids were victim of the one pill kills. Good families, everything looks fine on the outside. They're not isolating themselves. They're not having problems with friendship groups. They're doing well at school. Everything's fine at home. And suddenly these parents wake up one day to find their child dead in their own home. Now, one of the things I did notice about this was, first of all, we need to remove the stigma that everyday kids are somehow protected from this happening to them because that is no longer the case. And second of all, the fact that sometimes our kids are exposed to things that they don't know how to handle. So, one of the trends that I'm seeing regularly, not just in relation to drug use, but also in young adults doing things that they don't necessarily not regret in the future, is social media. So Snapchat is very often not considered to be the big bad guy when it comes to social media, purely because the algorithm is not spoken about as much and because it's so short and sharp and the pictures don't stay and it's got all of these safety mechanisms wound in. However, a lot of the trouble that I'm hearing in relation to young people and social media use comes from that platform. So I'm wondering, what did you see in relation to, or were you able to draw any correlations with young people who are finding themselves victims of drugs, not drug abuse, but one-time use, and social media.
Yeah. So when I went, yeah, I met with quite a few families, and before I went overseas to give myself some foundation knowledge, and my fellowship went for I was overseas for 10 weeks, admittedly 2 weeks of that. I sat down, I put my books down and enjoyed some of the sights of the United States. But so I was 8 weeks away with the fellowship.
Yeah.
And it was about really before I wanted to go over there, I wanted to get some foundation. And I talked about the pre-meetings that I had. I was touched and I was fortunate enough to have meetings with two people in particular, Jaime Puerta and Chris Didier. And both of those people, they're with a particular community group over in the United States, but they had both lost their son. They lost with Jaime, he lost his 16-year-old son, I think it was from memory, Daniel. And then with Chris, it was Zach. And both of those kids were great kids. Like they just were, I think Daniel was 16 and Zach was 17. And, they had great stories. With Daniel, he was the only child. With Zach, he was the only son. Growing up, everything was fine. And then one morning, they said goodnight one night to their parents, and the next morning, both of their fathers found them dead in their bedrooms. To hear their stories, and being a father myself, I suppose I closed my eyes for a moment and just put myself in their shoes. What would that would be experience? And I couldn't stay there. It was so traumatic, even for me, just to think what they must be going through just for that small space of time. And for those kids, they weren't addicted to any drug. They were just out to have a Percocet, just a little bit of an upper. They didn't think anything more of it. It was for them, it was that's all it was. One of them being Daniel, he only had half a pill. They found the other half of the pill in his room. But that pill was contained fentanyl, and both families had not heard of fentanyl at the time, and their kids had died. It was very touching, I suppose. As much as I was unable to meet them when I was overseas, their story, and I've been in contact with them since, has really touched me. And there's QR codes to hear their story. There's QR codes in my report where they've done documentaries, individual documentaries, which I encourage anyone who reads the report just to scan that QR code and listen to their stories. They their story was that of many. And when I went over to the DEA headquarters in the United States, there's a place called the Faces of Fentanyl, which is a memorial within DEA headquarters of just some of the faces of people affected by fentanyl. And what I was moved by was so many of the children that were there, so many kids that were featured on that wall, people who were 16, 17, who had all their lives before them, and it was just gone in an instant.
Mm.
Like there's so many challenges out there for kids now, and you talked about the big thing about stigma, and I think stigma is a big thing. Even over when I was over in the United States, where I would have thought that fentanyl was something that everyone was aware of, I was lucky to go around and visit a couple of schools when they were doing some outreach stuff. The FBI and the DEA was doing some outreach stuff within schools, and had the opportunity to just talk to a couple of kids and say, "Do you know what fentanyl is?" And these kids come from all walks of life, and they said no.
No idea.
And so that in itself was scary. Here's a drug that killed 73,000 Americans in 1 year, and they didn't even know what fentanyl was. There's the stigma of that. We just don't talk about drugs. We don't, if it comes on television, we don't talk about it. We just muffle it going, oh, that won't happen to my child.
Mm.
That's the exact same view that Jaime had. That's the same view that Chris had. That's the same view that many had over there was this won't happen to me. So why do I need to talk about it? I don't need to talk about it. But you do need to talk about it. It's something that you should address, something they should make them aware of what drugs are out there, what they can do, and the harms that they can do to people. Understand like the why are they taking drugs? What would have a person to take drugs? And if it is them to hiding feelings, then obviously move past that and go, okay, we need to talk about that. Remove that stigma outright is a really good step.
Mm.
The social media in both of the instances that I talked about with Jaime and Chris and their kids, Daniel and Zach, both of them were able to acquire their tablets from Snapchat chats. Needless to say, they're heavily on the campaigns to make Snapchat come to account. There's been some changes to legislation over in the United States that's particular for that since my journey over there. But social media and the management of social media, it's a platform that people can communicate. And it's a platform that, unfortunately, like all organized crime, and I suppose take a step back and to understand organized crime is ultimately just a profit making business. It really is. And whatever they can do to make a profit, they will do. They don't run on any rules like the rest of us. Organized crime will do whatever they want to make a profit. And one of the things that they are very good at is being able to exploit things that are in our community for good and have good intentions behind them. And they will look at it and find ways to exploit them. That is no different with social media. It's completely can be exploited by organized crime. And what we find is drug dealers are on there selling their markets, whatever their market may be. We had a recent case in Australia where there was selling vapes, THC vapes, and I'm sure that recent case, and those THC vapes were said to contain nitazines. And I'm sure that's not the only story that's out there. That's happening quite frequently, and the kids would see that all the time. And that's what it was for Daniel and Zach, is they just went on there to grab a pill. And then they just met the kids. I think for Zach, it was he met him at the shopping center. For Daniel, he just went, it was a drop off. So he just went for, he walked his dog around the block and he picked up a pill from this guy. It was meant to be some form of medication pill, just diverted. But in actual fact, it was an adulterated pill that had fentanyl. They don't know where it's coming from. They're not testing it. They're not doing anything. They're just having it, just taking it on its say so. And unfortunately, it has terrible consequences.
Often the conversation also stops, doesn't it? I mean, we're talking about two kids here in amongst 70 something thousand in a year that are impacted by this. These two kids just went out and tried something with no idea that it had fentanyl in it. And it brings us to this assumption that we make in relation to people that are providing drugs. And you say it perfectly when you say organized crime doesn't have rules. Organized crime is a business and they are interested in profit. And if you are looking at this as a business, what you're looking to do is find the weaknesses and exploit the strengths. So that's what happens. And I think that a lot of us fall into the category of not wanting to consider organized crime for what it is. We don't understand it, and because we don't understand it, we can find ourselves easily shocked by the extremity of what happens in relation to making profit for organized crime. But one of the things that also is quite prevalent, and I noticed this when you were talking about both Daniel and Zach, who passed from a single use of a drug that they didn't even know had fentanyl in it, was these kids had everything going for them. There were absolutely no red flags. Typically, when you find a child that explores something that's illegal, which most prevalent now is drugs, automatically the parents cop the blame. Oh, the parents mustn't be present. The parents mustn't be active. I bet they fight. I bet it's not good at home. I bet it looks all sweet on the outside, but when you scratch beneath the surface, there's massive trauma in the house. But that's not always the case. These kids are going out and they're looking for something that they don't have. And often we're not actually looking at the real problem. We're looking at the distribution of the drug, the pill, the high, but we're not looking at the other two factors. Why these two boys went looking for it in the first place? Was it peer pressure? Were they curious? Did they have a safe space to have a conversation with, an open, safe space to have a conversation with? Their parents weren't even equipped about what fentanyl was. So if the boys even wanted to come and have a conversation about drugs, we don't know that mum and dad were even equipped to be able to have that conversation. But then the flip side of that coin, these boys accessed these pills so easily. So it's not just about how they access the pills, it's about where they got the pills from as well. We're not talking much about, well, these pills were given to them quite probably by A, other kids, or B, young adults who were just part of a process. And in that, those two groups of people need attention as well.
Yeah, look, a few things from that. The first is about the families, and everyone has a story, and that's a view that I would have to, and I openly admit, even in my report, that my view over time has changed. Coming in as a very fresh-eyed 19-year-old police officer to what I've seen now, I know, and my view of that is completely changed. For my own barriers, I think that we put, as police, you put some walls up to make sure that you can embrace things. But there was always one thing that's always stuck with me, and it was many years ago. It was an overdose death, and there was some concerns about from a family about their son who was heavily addicted to drugs. They hadn't heard from him for a few days, and they felt something bad had happened. And I was given a key to a unit. They didn't want to go into the unit because I was concerned about what they would find. And I remember going in there and finding their son had passed away, and he still had a needle still in his arm. And I'll never forget. And that's a bit like that. That's the tale that's been told 1,000 times before. But for me, what I don't forget is what I saw when I spoke to the parents and informed them of it. What I saw was not the instant sadness that you would expect like when they've lost a child. And when I say a child, this person was in his 30s at that stage. But for them, it was nearly looked like relief. And I couldn't process it at the time. But I've never forgotten it. And I think over time I've always revisited that particular reaction that I saw. And I'm sure as a police officer, you only see them for that small period of time and then you move on. And obviously, they would have had, I've got no doubt, a lot of grieving in there and that would always be with them forever. So I always understood that, but it was a case of just that initial reaction. What caused that initial reaction? And now when I look at it, like that was a good family. They were a perfectly fine family. They were a working class family in Western Sydney that, likened to my family, likened to many other families that could relate. There was nothing that was sort of untoward, no suggestion of influence that the family influenced that type of addiction, that they were good people. And unfortunately, their son had taken a few wrong turns. But it was all about that reaction and that relief, and I couldn't get it. And then over time, I've realized it, and especially even on this particular trip, is that they've gone through hell trying to do, and they've done absolutely all they can to try to get, as in this case, their son, or but just their loved one, to do what they can. They would have gone to all the meetings and tried to get him to go to meetings. They would have tried to get him in the rehab. They would have tried to put him and hospitalize him. They would have at times and at the start in particular probably given him money just to keep him and quell him because of what the pain that they see because of what the addiction caused. And then in over time they would have also accepted or been confronted with things being stolen as a result of their loved one stealing to pay for their addiction. And then they go through the hatred of their loved one because they've tried to make a stop on the addiction by saying, no, we're not fueling it. So we're not going to give you money. And then obviously wearing it. They would have gone through all of this because this is the stories that I got told through addiction, people with long-term addiction, and how that what happened and how their families eventually end up having to distance themselves, not because they don't love their loved one, it's because they've got to protect themselves and usually protecting the other siblings that there's around them. Organized crime just exploits all facets, and it will find a way. It looks for our vulnerable parts of our community, and that's where it attacks and exploits it. And then they'll rip that apart. And part of my trip was obviously I trying to identify some parts of our community that were vulnerable and then focus on them. And for me, a lot of that was youth. It's certainly the youth that becomes vulnerable. It is certainly a vulnerable part. It's a time where, in all of our youth, it becomes a time of exploration, a time of defiance. There's so many things that as a youth, and I'm certainly no angel. I can recall my youth, and there's certainly a few my
Oh,
friends out
was you
there.
were an angel for sure. I can't imagine you doing anything that you shouldn't have done.
No, I was an absolute saint. So, but like all those emotions that someone as a child and as a youth goes through, and I do align it to my own as I was, and as I said before, there was a time where there was an intersection, and I do recall for me there was. I remember it vividly. It was a time there was an intersection where it was either a case I'd pull my head in and take another path, or I could keep going down the path I was, and I certainly wouldn't be the person that's here before you today. And the vulnerabilities, that is such a heavily vulnerable place. You mentioned sort of one pathway sort of to get there, but I think there's multiple pathways. Like it's hard to understand, and that's one of the big things I think we've done in the past is we've tried to template things through our recovery processes. And this was discussed in a few places I went, in Canada in particular, where recovery processes, be it rehabilitation in particular, it has this step by plan how it thinks it's going to go through things. And if you fall off that step by step plan, then you haven't achieved what the goals, and they drop you like a hot rock. Whereas other places like Portugal and Crochet, one of their biggest things is meeting them where they are and obviously accepting, okay, they've got problems and it's going to take some while to get through it. But there's a lot of layers to this onion, and we need to peel back each one individually, not make assumptions that this is the same as the person next to them. It's not the same as the person that was before them. Each individual, if you see an individual now and you see an individual and they come back to you 5 years later, don't assume it's the same problems. Like they accept that everyone's different, everyone's individual, and you need to deal with everyone uniquely. Now
Mm.
that's not good when you're trying to set up a nice little template program to
No,
be able.
one size all approach.
You can't do that. So, for some people, it may be there's trauma comes in all different settings. It may have been a case of defiance and exploration, and then all of a sudden, where they said they were fine and they can get out every time, they just couldn't get out. It's said there's the trauma. Someone's just trying to hide something, so they take it just as an escape.
Yeah.
But then, after a while, even that, as their addiction gets heavier, they need bigger forms to escape or more potency to escape to reach those places where they can at least have a moment to release. It's people to hide. Social settings, yes, peer pressure certainly it takes its part, and as a youth, and even depending on where you are in your life, those social settings and that peer pressure is something that could be quite challenging. But like we've just both said, each individual it reacts to differently,
Yeah.
and some people just can't pull out in time. So
And that's the fundamental, that's the foundation of what we need to remember is we are all uniquely different while being immensely similar. And you've
definitely,
demonstrated that so many times. And to this day, for me, one of the most heartbreaking, I think is possibly the right word, statements that I have ever heard in my life was experienced while I sat in those Narcotics Anonymous meetings where one by one the men or women would get up and say, "Hi, I'm such and such and I'm an addict. I've been X amount of days sober." I still remember one particular day where this young man got up. He must have been no more than 18. He was tall, he was scrawny. You knew straight away that he'd had a heavy history. And he got up very shaky, very faint in his voice, stood up reluctantly, but you could tell that he was mustering every bit of courage that he had. And there were only about a dozen people in this room. He'd been there before. He was familiar with the space and with the people, but he still struggled to get up and say, "My name is Andrew and I'm an addict. It's been 0 days since my last." And to watch him as he first of all, he shows us that vulnerability. But also, whilst you see this vulnerability, you've got this extinguished fire that's barely burning, but is so desperate to overcome this choice that continuously just drives his existence. And it's taken every bit of courage that he's had to get himself to that meeting, to sit there, and he was the last person to stand up. And you could see him. He's wringing his hands. He's nervous. He's thinking about moving. He's fidgeting in his chair. And his sponsor's sitting opposite in him, just kind of trying to calm him, trying to calm his nervous system. Just don't run. And one of the things that we misunderstand so much about. Before we move on to solutions, though, I want to touch briefly on something that you mentioned about a defining moment for you. I think we all, if we were to look at it and look at some of our history, we're a compilation of defining moments where we could have easily have gone one way instead of the other. Do you remember what influenced you to choose the path that you did at that defining moment?
I think for me, it was many moons ago now, but for me, I think that what just it was the choice was seeing more so. It was a very blunt approach by a person who sat me down, and he was an adult, and he was a father to a friend of mine, and he told me where he thought my future would be in 10 years' time, doing what I was doing. And he told me the hard truths about that. And of course, being as defiant as I was at the time, I went, no, I'm going to prove you wrong.
Mm,
So it's something, and obviously I've never had a chance to speak to him again about that. But at the same time, it's a bit of a, I always think it's a bit of an fu to him now. But he done it for the right reasons, and I know that. And it was for me, it was just to show, no, I'm going to make something of myself. I'm not going to be the person that you said I was going to be. And then that allowed me to pick myself back up, finish school. And then for me, there was only a very short time in between. I was a country kid. I wanted to get back to the city, and I knew that my pathway to get back to the city was by full-time employment. And by that, it's always was going to be that I wanted to join the New South Wales Police Force.
wow. Thank goodness for the man that had the courage to step out and just say, hey, was you and I going to have a little bit of a chat, mate? And maybe it'll be influential for the right reasons, but I feel compelled right now to try and look after you, even though you are not my own son. I see something and I have the capacity and the willingness to step out of my own fatherhood role and to role model you as much as you'll let me.
Yeah, and look, it was and that blunt approach is what I needed. It was definitely couldn't do it any other way. The approach he took was certainly at the time, and probably for the next 10 years, is something that I always kept fighting against. But it was the perfect approach. That was my individual approach. That was the way that he needed to communicate to me to make sure it sunk through at the time. And yeah, I really have a lot to thank him for.
Evidence that it really does take a village.
Yeah, it does.
So
Yes, it
let's
does.
talk solutions. We've got a lot of context here about what's going on, not just in Australia, but globally. We've got some education on what we're dealing with. We've heard of fentanyl. We're understanding some of the processes that other countries are taking, that not everything's working, that some of it's failing badly. And also that at this current point in time, Australia is largely unaffected by the fentanyl outbreak that's being experienced in other countries, but we have problems of our own. In your fellowship report, you made some suggestions around solutions. Before I get into that, though, the Australian National Drug Strategy also had a royal commission quite some time ago. There was a royal commission that came into the use of drugs. And this particular one for the National Drug Strategy, the main objective was to prevent uptake and delay first use of drugs. And it was in relation to the New South Wales Special Commission of Inquiry into ICE. So that was a separate inquiry that was done. They had 109 recommendations, and the inquiry is a couple of years old. You can have a look with the link that I'm providing here. One of them is decriminalisation, and I'm not going to ask your thoughts on that because you have already referenced how in some cases it's been tried and it was what we might class as an epic fail. But let me ask you this. When we're talking about solutions, do you think that we can ever as not just a country, Australia, but as a world, stamp out drugs completely?
No, and look, that's my obviously this is my personal view, but no, I mentioned it before. I think drugs in some way or form is always going to be in society. There's obviously there's different types of drugs, and as we move forward, obviously synthetics they're here to stay, in my view. And the exploration of novel substances will continue to happen in whatever form it goes on, whether that's in pills or capsules or liquids or vapes or whatever. My personal concern is pills and vapes. They can hide a lot of the highly potent substances, and it only takes sort of one breath, taking one pill, and can have very tragic consequences. Now,
Mm,
I don't think we can ever rule out drugs, but it's obviously we can certainly be a bit more progressive in our approach. Like I said, the war on drugs, it's been happening for so long. We can sit here and keep kicking that same tin down the road forever and ever. Or we
mm,
can start looking at some ways that we can obviously look towards, as I said, it's not going to ever stamp it out, but we can look at other ways to obviously increase awareness, be more in contact with our community and society over various fronts, and obviously address the problem differently instead of trying to charge our way out of it. Like when we talk about decriminalization, it doesn't mean that we just openly just arrest and charge everyone either. There's an in between. There's an in between line that a lot of places across the world, including here in New South Wales, it has seen and they're implementing, but everything is implemented slowly. And that's not a bad thing, as I said before.
yeah.
It takes time, but there is some good things afoot that are happening in that space. And over time, I'd like to see that little space just opens up just that little bit more, and we can fill that with a few more different things as well. So there's some good alternates between. We still need to have the police do something about it. If it gets too far, the police needs to be there. So enforcement needs to be there, and laws still always need to be there. It all comes down to that exploitation piece as well. If we start taking away the laws, there's always a way that organized crime can exploit it. You always
Yeah.
need them, but it doesn't mean that we just, as I said, charge. We can, in that space that we fill, we can look at some other things that certainly can be done not by law enforcement, but by other areas, maybe health, maybe other community groups that can go towards making some positive change to our community and some greater awareness and hopefully reduce the amount of demand there is, especially for these synthetics and those type of novel substances.
And what I'm hearing in that also is a warning. You mentioned vapes. So,
Mm.
our kids might be thinking that, oh, I'm just vaping, it's no big deal, it's not as bad as cigarettes. But what they actually could be inhaling is something as extreme as fentanyl.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And look, there's been tests globally, and when I was over in Bath, they had done some tests. They collected, from memory, don't quote me on it, for about 200 vapes from schools that had been confiscated in schools. And what they were finding in some of those vapes was actually quite scary. What the kids thought was just vapes were not vapes, they were THC, they were other harder drugs. I mentioned that we've had an experience here in New South Wales where there was vapes found that have zincs in
Yeah,
it. Like it is scary what they could have, and because the kids are buying these in the same way as Zach and Daniel bought
yeah,
tablets, they're just buying them online and they're just getting them sent to them. Like they've got no validation about what is in those, what the contents of those vapes are, what's in that actual liquid. And it's the same, as I said, with tablets. So, but the problem with the tablet is more so. So vapes can create an addiction, even though the kid doesn't even know it. They can actually create an addiction, and then next thing you know, they can be in hospital with this addiction to some opioid that they had no idea that they were taking. With a pill, they don't even get those opportunities.
no,
And what we need to understand with pills, and that's my other big concern, is they don't make pills when it's clandestine laboratories. They don't sit there and make sure that there's one part to every five parts. They
no,
just put a scoop that will do, with a couple of scoops that will do, put it in
chuck
a
it in.
bucket and give
Looks
it a
about
bit of a
right.
shake around. So
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's literally what we see.
Mm.
So there is no proper grading of that. You could have 10 pills that were produced immediately beside each other. They were produced one after each other. And out of those pills, you could have seven pills that are a good ratio and you have a great night, as the kids would say. You would have two that probably have no effect, but then you've got one that's actually an actual killer because it's clumped there. Like to me, having a pill is like playing, especially with fentanyl and those drugs around now. It's dead set. To me, it's like playing Russian roulette when you've
Yeah.
got six loaded bullets in the gun.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And I mean, you think about how many kids are out there vaping, and just to think about the fact that that child could actually be getting addicted and they have no awareness. You see the dance parties where pills so easily transfer hands, and it's like you don't know what's in this stuff. And realistically, the only way to be sure is physically not to touch it.
yeah, that's exactly right. So it's and it's the scary notion that is out there, and
Yeah,
that's the education. I think that for me, that's something that the education needs to be more in the future about. I know there was a recent report to say that the vaping is just as bad as smoking cigarettes, but it's much more. Like vaping is much more. The fact that they can put these cartridges in there and they can load these cartridges with whatever, it's a scary thought. And
yeah,
especially moving forward as new synthetics and as new novel substances are produced.
yeah,
Yes, certainly fentanyl's on the way down, and that's a fantastic thing. And nitazines, the amount of nitazines that we're seeing is tapered, which is also fantastic. But it doesn't mean that there's not something else, the next best thing happening. Because organized crime, it's all about profit and profiteering, and they'll be looking at something to they exploit the youth and what can they get into the youth, and they'll be trying to look for the next best thing. And then we've just got to be always vigilant of that.
So you yourself came up with a three-pronged approach in relation to prevention. We've got three pillars here of demand reduction, harm minimization, and law enforcement.
Yeah, it was something I probably wouldn't claim it. It's something that I saw a lot of approach, and it's something that I wanted to take on it as well. I should note though that in my travel and especially for my recommendations, I didn't. And you mentioned the special inquiry into ICE. One of the things it was very deliberate in my approach. I come in with, I suppose, a police officer's way of thinking. It was a pretty hard-nosed way of thinking. I didn't think my view and opinions would be changed. I certainly didn't think my journey was going to be a life-changing experience. I was familiar with obviously a scholarship in the past, and I remember going to a Churchill event and them saying that, and I went, "Yeah, that's true, but not for me." I felt that what I was going to do, as much as I was planning to have a massive trip in respect to where I went, how many meetings I was planning, the pre-planning, and that was just so much. But I didn't think it was going to be life changing. It was very much life changing. I come back a completely different person in a positive way, I'd like to think. But the going back to the my ideas before I went overseas, I deliberately didn't look at, and I was aware of it. I was fully aware that there was the ICE inquiry out there, and I was fully aware of that it made some recommendations, and that was financed by government, and it was there. I was also aware that there was a recent drug summit, and just before I was going overseas, and I was hoping it wasn't going to be published, and it wasn't, fortunately. There was some recommendations that were due to be published when I went overseas, and I deliberately didn't want to look at them. I wanted to go over, and I suppose the best way I explain it is wanted to go over as a blank canvas. I had my hard nose approached. There was no doubt about that. And I wanted to be changed. I wanted to see if people could change my mind. And the way to do that was obviously put myself in those immersive areas to have those discussions with everyone. And then ultimately, I was just going to the ideas that come out that painted that canvas was going to be ideas that were fleshed out purely from my trip. There was certainly a place for the ICE inquiry recommendations and the drug summit recommendations when I returned, but it wasn't until I completed my paper in full before I wanted to look at them. But I also had a bit of an idea as I was writing my recommendations, as I was coming home on a plane, I sat back and spent quite a bit of time developing my recommendations. And as I was writing them out, I went like, I knew in myself as I was writing them that they weren't going to be original. They were going to be ones that I had no doubt that I would see featured in both of those papers that I talked about. But it meant what was original was the way that they come about. They come about as a result of my journey and my personal journey and speaking to the people I did. You know, do I think that these recommendations, am I going to be able to change it myself? Probably not, but they're layered on top of these recommendations from other places. They're, as I said, from another point of view. And all these points of view and these perspectives hopefully will go towards influencing someone or going towards assisting lobbying someone who wants to make a positive change in the community. You know, as it was back in the day when we originally had an inquiry under Bob Carr and they made some big changes then. And then I suppose that's what everyone had the sight of seeing when they've made these recommendations in the much larger government-based papers. And, you know, eventually in the end, that's what I like to see some of mine do, is just being part of those positive changes in the future.
And how can people get involved with that at all?
Well, I know. I'm still trying to work that out myself. So I think that in the end, it comes down to just the right person reading the report, really, for me. I do my best to sort of put that out there to the right forums. Admittedly, my paper was a little bit heavier than most of the Churchill papers that are actually out there. For me, I love my job. I'm not out looking to change my career by any means. I'm very well institutionalized and I don't make any apologies for it. I love doing what I'm doing. But for me, this paper was obviously a personal journey that I always knew that I myself wasn't going to be able to progress forward myself. And it was always going to be that leverage piece for someone else. But when I wrote it, I actually wrote a lot, probably more than what I should. Actually, it was a lot more than what was required. And I had to ask special permission and very much thank you to the Churchill Fellowship for allowing that to be produced the way it was. Everything I've put pretty much put everything on the table. There's no aces under the table waiting for another time. It's all in the report. And to me, it's now just, I suppose, reaching and continuing to try to speak to people, showing that, I suppose, in essence, that you can teach an old dog new tricks. But it's obviously, for me, it's obviously embracing, always being contemporary, being collaborative is very much one of the things. I think for many years we've remained too siloed in what we do in many professions, and we need to be all sitting at the same table. Those contemporary, we need to be a lot more contemporary. We can't rely on things that worked well 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago,
Absolutely.
and expect that they're going to work now when kids have got an attention span. I think I saw it the other day of 8 seconds before they're flicking to the next screen.
Is that why
So,
my son never hears me? He's already
oh,
tuned out.
I know that's the same in my house. So it's, how you work with those type of, the work with people of today is not going to be the same. So it's
Mm,
about being that, and we've got to be progressive as well. So it's not only just contemporary, but progressive. Our approaches need to be accepting of, okay, things are not working, and be, I suppose, have enough humility to understand that we need to make changes, and finding those people and someone coming in, I suppose, in the right positions to be wanting to make those changes. And those changes it's going to take courage. It really is, because it's going to be something that you will become under criticism for. But there will be people out there that will be supporting of it. But obviously, unfortunately, it is going to be someone who has a lot of courage to come in to want some of those changes to happen.
absolutely. Oh, yeah. I can see how there's a lot of work to be done moving forward.
It's,
Absolutely, a lot of work. And I will put the report itself, attach it to this episode of the podcast. And I encourage anybody who watches this to absolutely have a look at the report. But I'm going to go a little bit further. I'd like everybody who's gotten this far in this episode to take on a challenge. And the challenge is simply this. One of the things that we've made absolutely clear, I'm sure, is that it takes a village to be able to not just get involved, but also to look to eradicate a problem that we've identified as simply massive. And then one of the easiest ways that you can do that is to educate yourself. Educate yourself on addiction, educate yourself on what's out there, educate yourself on our kids, on what to look for. If you are no longer a frontline parent with a child living in your home, it doesn't mean that you cannot contribute. If you are a person that has never gone through this and doesn't have any understanding of it, it doesn't mean you can't contribute. There are multiple ways that you can contribute, and one of the ways that we can all, every single one of us, get involved in this fight against drugs is simply to be available. Much like that father was when he was a young teenager that was rebellious and ready to tell the world he was going to do things his own way. Imagine this. Imagine if that man hadn't have spoken up. Was and I may not be having this conversation today. He may not have traveled the world. He may not have found a purpose to do what he's doing. And this may not exist. All because one man decided that he was going to have a conversation with somebody else's son because he cared. So if you've looked at this podcast and watched it, please like, subscribe, and absolutely share and share. Follow Warren on his socials, which I'm going to include here, and follow the journey of not just what he's learned so far, but what you can do to contribute. We're never going to get rid of drugs. They're here. They're here to stay. The question will always be, how much damage do they cause while they're here? And how personal is that damage going to be to you? Don't forget, if you haven't been affected yet, it doesn't mean that you won't be. It just means that so far you've been lucky. I thank you so much for your time today. We didn't get to talk about Rat Park and the test that was done in the 70s, which concluded that the rats that didn't have connection with others were more likely to be involved in the addictive side of drug taking. And when they were in an environment that was connective, that involved curiosity and had an element of fun, they avoided the drugs that were kept inside of their pen. But now that I've put that there, I will add that is definitely worth searching up. So I no doubt the audience will do that. Again, I appreciate your time, and more than that, the effort that you've taken, not just to take 10 weeks out of your life last year, but also back in 2015 for the effort that you give in your day-to-day job, which no doubt goes largely unnoticed, as do a lot of our first responders. And I know that you are taking part in a CrossFit workout in a couple of weeks, which I've silly enough to rope myself into. And you're supporting again the community and doing a 24-hour workout. So before we wrap up, if you'd like to just give a 30-second outline of exactly what that is and what that's for.
Now, okay, so yes, me, Joe, and 34 of our friends are crazily getting together to do 24 hours for heroes. It's a challenge that's actually been set up by a gym out in Nepean, but it's now extended past that and beyond that. And they're out to raise funds for defense and first responders that have got PTSD and to raise that awareness. It's something that has touched me. Unfortunately, I've lost some really good friends to PTSD and the Black Dog. And I think all police and all first responders and all defense have all been touched in some way. And it's, I suppose, my part of giving back in one way or form to do my bit to raise funds for what I believe is a very worthwhile cause. And I put it out there to a couple of guys, and next thing I know, I've got 36 people sitting in a gym for 24 hours, and we're going to be doing something stupid in that time.
So this podcast is going to be released pretty quickly. We have around about, I think about 11 days
Yeah, we
before
do.
we go and we do this. There'll be 24 hours, 36 of us in a gym, teams of six. And on every hour, on every hour, we are doing a hero workout. It'll be published on social media. I'm going to make sure I raise as much funds as I possibly can for it. And I encourage everyone, as does was, to get involved. We have proved more than beyond a benefit of a doubt today that it doesn't take a lot from any one person. But if every single person contributes a little bit, then the progress will always be forward. So if you're interested in getting involved in this, the QR code is appearing on the screen right now. If you're not already following the Think Uncommon podcast, please make sure that you do on Facebook for updates on what's coming out when, and also on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. There will be more episodes, and I will continue to showcase what we call uncommon men. And as you can see with the quality that we have today with Detective Inspector Warren Lysaght, did I get that right?
You did.
We have some pretty good men out there. So if you're ever wondering about whether we have good men or whether you should believe everything about the manosphere, here's yet another example of a guy that's getting out and getting it done because he gives a damn. So thank you again, Warren. I will see you at the gym when we prepare for 24 hours of annihilation, and I will see you afterwards, probably cursing you all the way through. But I know we're going to have an amazing time doing it for all the right reasons.
Certainly will. And thank you for your time, Joe. It's much appreciated. And thank you to everyone for listening in.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you on the next episode.